The thunderous hooves of her stolen mare pounded against the muddy earth as Elizabeth Caldwell fled into the stormy night, each flash of lightning illuminating the tattered remains of her once fine dress. Blood mingled with rain on her pale skin, though whether it was hers or someone else's, she hardly knew anymore. Behind her lay the burning remains of everything she'd once called home. Ahead, only the vast unknown of the Colorado wilderness, a treacherous promise of either freedom or death in the spring of 1876. Elizabeth's lungs burned as she pushed the mare harder, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the men who had destroyed her life. The rain fell in angry sheets, obscuring her vision and soaking her to the bone. Her dress, once a lovely shade of blue, now hung in tatters around her trembling form, ripped and torn during her desperate escape from the farmhouse. "Come on, girl," she urged the exhausted horse. "Just a little farther." The mare, sensing her rider's desperation, surged forward through the storm. Elizabeth had no destination in mind, just away. Away from the smoke, away from the gunshots, away from the brutal gang that had appeared at her family's homestead just after sunset. A branch caught her sleeve as they passed beneath a tree, tearing the fabric further and leaving a fresh scratch along her arm. Elizabeth hardly noticed. The cold had numbed her skin, and fear had numbed everything else. When the mare finally stumbled, nearly sending Elizabeth tumbling into the mud, she knew they couldn't continue. The poor animal was at her limit, sides heaving with exertion. Elizabeth slid from the saddle, her bare feet sinking into the cold mud. She had lost her shoes somewhere in the chaos of her escape. "I'm sorry," she whispered, leading the exhausted horse toward a copse of trees that offered minimal shelter from the relentless downpour. Elizabeth leaned against the mare's warm side, shivering violently as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving only cold terror and grief in its wake. Her parents. Gone. Their small homestead burned to the ground, everything she'd ever known destroyed in a single night of violence. Silent tears mixed with the raindrops on her face as she slid down to sit at the base of a tree, pulling her knees to her chest in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent a fresh wave of panic through her body. They had found her. They had tracked her through the storm. Elizabeth stumbled to her feet, ready to flee again, but her legs gave out beneath her, weak from exhaustion and cold. The rider appeared through the curtain of rain, a tall silhouette atop a powerful black stallion. Elizabeth pressed herself against the tree trunk, frantically searching for a weapon, anything to defend herself. Her fingers closed around a fallen branch, hardly a match for a gun, but better than nothing. "Hello," a deep voice called out. "Is someone there?" Elizabeth remained silent, clutching her makeshift weapon. The rider dismounted, approaching cautiously. "I saw your horse," he explained. "Are you hurt?" When he stepped into the small clearing, Elizabeth could finally make out his features. He wasn't one of the men who had attacked her home. This man was younger, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jawline shadowed by several days' growth of beard. His clothes were those of a working cowboy, worn denim, leather chaps, and a dripping hat pulled low over his eyes. "Stay back," Elizabeth warned, raising the branch. The cowboy stopped immediately, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you, miss. My name's Gabriel Hayes. I work at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles east of here." "How do I know you're not with them?" Elizabeth demanded, her voice barely audible over the storm. "With who?" Gabriel asked, his brow furrowing with concern as he took in her appearance, the torn dress, the scratches on her arms, the wild fear in her eyes. "My God, what happened to you?" A flash of lightning illuminated them both, and Gabriel's expression changed to one of horrified understanding. Without hesitation, he shrugged out of his heavy oilskin duster and approached her slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "You're freezing," he said gently. "Please take my coat." Elizabeth hesitated, the branch still raised defensively. "I swear on my mother's grave, I mean you no harm," Gabriel insisted, "but you'll catch your death out here dressed like that." Something in his earnest gaze convinced Elizabeth to lower her makeshift weapon. Or perhaps it was simply that she had no strength left to fight. When Gabriel carefully draped the warm coat around her shoulders, she nearly collapsed with relief at its immediate warmth. Thank you, she whispered. Gabriel nodded, keeping a respectful distance. Can you tell me what happened? Who did this to you? Elizabeth's lips trembled as she fought back a sob. They came to our farm, 5 men they wanted. She trailed off, unable to speak of the horrors she had witnessed. My parents tried to fight them. They burned everything. I ran. Gabriel's expression hardened. Riley's gang, he muttered, almost to himself. They've been terrorizing homesteaders all across the territory. He looked at her with new concern. Did they follow you? I don't know, Elizabeth admitted, glancing fearfully over her shoulder. I rode as fast as I could. We need to get you somewhere safe, Gabriel decided. The ranch where I work isn't far. The owner, Mrs. Reynolds, is a good woman. She'll help you. Elizabeth clutched the coat tighter around herself. Why should I trust you? Gabriel considered her question seriously. You shouldn't, he finally said. You don't know me, but you can't stay out here and I can't leave you here in good conscience, so I reckon we're at an impasse, miss. Despite everything, Elizabeth felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips at his honesty. Elizabeth, she said. Elizabeth Caldwell. Miss Caldwell, Gabriel acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. Will you let me help you? Another crack of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening boom of thunder that spooked both horses. As Elizabeth's mare bolted into the darkness, she made her decision. I don't have much choice, do I, Mr. Hayes? Gabriel smiled gently. I suppose not. Can you ride? When Elizabeth nodded, he led her to his stallion. With surprising strength, he lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. His presence at her back was solid and warm, and despite her fear and grief, Elizabeth found herself leaning into that warmth as they set off through the storm. Gabriel kept one arm securely around her waist as he guided the horse with his other hand. It's not far, he promised. Just hold on. Elizabeth nodded wearily, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion as the rhythmic motion of the horse lulled her into a state between wakefulness and sleep. The last thing she remembered was the steady beat of Gabriel's heart against her back, a counterpoint to the dwindling storm. When Elizabeth next opened her eyes, she was lying in a clean bed in an unfamiliar room. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, casting patterns on a simple wooden floor. For a moment, she thought perhaps the events of the previous night had been a terrible nightmare until she tried to sit up and felt every muscle in her body protest. Easy there, a woman's voice cautioned. You've been through quite an ordeal. Elizabeth turned her head to see an older woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. She sat in a rocking chair near the bed, a piece of mending in her capable hands. Mrs. Reynolds, Elizabeth guessed. The woman nodded. And you're Elizabeth Caldwell. Gabriel told me what happened, or what little he knows, at least. Her kind eyes filled with sympathy. I'm so sorry about your parents, child. The simple acknowledgement of her loss broke something inside Elizabeth. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks as the full weight of her grief crashed over her. Mrs. Reynolds set aside her mending and moved to sit on the edge of the bed, gathering Elizabeth into a motherly embrace. There now, she soothed. You go ahead and cry. It's the only way to begin healing. Elizabeth clung to the older woman, sobbing until she had no tears left. When she finally pulled away, embarrassed by her breakdown, Mrs. Reynolds simply handed her a handkerchief. Thank you, Elizabeth whispered, dabbing at her swollen eyes. No need for thanks, Mrs. Reynolds replied. Now, I've had a bath prepared for you, and I've set out some clean clothes. They belonged to my daughter before she moved east to get married, but they should fit you well enough until we can get you something proper. Elizabeth's fingers traced the edge of the quilt covering her. You're very kind to take in a stranger, Mrs. Reynolds smiled. Any decent person would do the same. Besides, Gabriel vouched for you, and that boy has the best judgment of any cowhand I've ever employed. She rose and moved toward the door. The bath is just through there. Take your time. When you're ready, come down to the kitchen for some breakfast. You must be starving. After Mrs. Reynolds left, Elizabeth managed to climb out of bed, wincing at her stiff muscles. She found herself wearing a simple cotton nightgown. Someone had changed her out of her ruined clothes while she slept. The thought should have embarrassed her, but she felt only gratitude. The promised bath was heaven. Elizabeth sank into the warm water, washing away the mud, blood, and terror of the previous night. As she scrubbed her skin clean, she allowed herself to truly face what had happened. Her parents were dead. Their farm was destroyed. She was alone in the world with nothing but the borrowed clothes on her back. The thought threatened to overwhelm her again, but Elizabeth forced it down. She would grieve, yes, but she would also survive. She had to, after dressing in the clothes Mrs. Reynolds had provided a simple calico dress that was only slightly too large. Elizabeth made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee and bacon to the kitchen. Mrs. Reynolds was at the stove, turning bacon in a cast iron skillet. At the large wooden table sat Gabriel Hayes, looking much different than he had the night before. Clean-shaven now, with his dark hair neatly combed, he rose quickly when Elizabeth entered the room. "Miss Caldwell," he greeted her, a hint of color touching his cheeks. "You're looking much better." "Thanks to you, Mr. Hayes," Elizabeth replied. "I never properly thanked you for saving my life last night." Gabriel shook his head. "I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Anyone would have done the same." "Not anyone," Elizabeth contradicted softly, thinking of the men who had destroyed her home. "I owe you my life." "Nonsense," Mrs. Reynolds interjected, setting a plate of food in front of Elizabeth. "What you owe us is to eat a proper meal and regain your strength." "Gabriel, stop hovering and sit down." Gabriel complied, though his eyes remained on Elizabeth as she took her first bite of food. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. The simple meal of bacon, eggs, and biscuits tasted better than any fine dining she'd ever experienced. "I've sent word to Sheriff Miller about what happened," Mrs. Reynolds informed her as she joined them at the table. "He'll want to speak with you when you're up to it." Elizabeth nodded, her appetite suddenly diminishing at the thought of recounting the horrors she'd witnessed. "You don't have to do anything until you're ready," Gabriel assured her, seeming to sense her discomfort. "The sheriff's a good man. He's been trying to catch Riley's gang for months now." "Do you think?" Elizabeth hesitated, setting down her fork. "Do you think they'll come looking for me?" A shadow crossed Gabriel's face. "If they know you survived, they might. Riley doesn't like leaving witnesses." Seeing her fear, he quickly added, "But they have no way of knowing where you are. You're safe here." Mrs. Reynolds reached across the table to pat Elizabeth's hand. "The Double R is one of the largest ranches in the territory. We have plenty of hands who know how to use a gun if need be. No one will harm you here, child." Elizabeth tried to take comfort in their assurances, but the memory of the gang's brutality was too fresh. "I don't want to put you in danger," she protested. "Perhaps I should move on." "And go where?" Mrs. Reynolds asked practically. "No, you'll stay here until we figure something out. I could use some help around the house anyway. My arthritis makes certain tasks difficult these days." Elizabeth recognized the offer for what it was: charity disguised as employment to preserve her dignity. "I'm a hard worker," she said gratefully. "I can cook, clean, so anything you need." "I know you are," Mrs. Reynolds smiled. "Now finish your breakfast. Gabriel will show you around the property later if you're feeling up to it." Gabriel nodded, a warm smile lighting his features. "It would be my pleasure, Miss Caldwell." As Elizabeth resumed eating, she found herself studying Gabriel Hayes more closely. In the light of day, she could see that he was quite handsome, with intelligent hazel eyes and strong features. His hands, wrapped around his coffee mug, were calloused from hard work. Yet there was a gentleness to them that she remembered from the night before: the careful way he had draped his coat around her shoulders, the secure but respectful arm that had held her in the saddle. For the first time since the attack, Elizabeth felt something other than fear and grief stir within her. It was a tiny spark, barely perceptible beneath the weight of her sorrow, but it was there nonetheless, a flicker of hope that perhaps her life wasn't entirely destroyed after all. Later that morning, true to his word, Gabriel showed Elizabeth around the ranch. The Double R was indeed impressive: a sprawling property with a large main house, bunkhouse for the ranch hands, stables, corrals, and outbuildings. Fields of cattle stretched as far as the eye could see, with distant figures on horseback moving among them. "Mrs. Reynolds runs this whole operation herself?" Elizabeth asked as they walked along a fence line, the spring sun warming their backs. Gabriel nodded. "Has done since Mr. Reynolds passed 5 years ago. She's as tough as they come, but fair. Best boss I've ever had." How long have you worked here? 3 years now, Gabriel replied. Came west from Missouri after the war, didn't have much direction until Mrs. Reynolds took a chance on me. Elizabeth glanced at him curiously. You fought in the war, a shadow passed over Gabriel's face. Yes, madam, Union Army. I was just a boy, really enlisted at 17, saw things no one should have to see. He shook his head as if to dispel the memories, but that's ancient history now. Elizabeth sensed there was more to his story, but she didn't press. Everyone had their ghosts, and she had no right to disturb his. What about you? Gabriel asked, clearly eager to change the subject. Have you lived in Colorado Territory long? All my life, Elizabeth answered. My parents came west when I was just a baby. They built our farm from nothing. Her voice caught as she added, it was all we had. Gabriel stopped walking and turned to face her. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Miss Caldwell. No one should have to endure what you've been through. Elizabeth blinked back tears. Please call me Elizabeth. After what we've been through, Miss Caldwell seems overly formal. Gabriel's expression softened. Elizabeth then, and I'm Gabriel. They continued their tour, Gabriel pointing out various aspects of ranch life and introducing her to some of the other workers they encountered. Everyone was unfailingly kind, though Elizabeth noticed the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed in their wake. News of her arrival and the circumstances surrounding it had clearly spread throughout the ranch. By midday, exhaustion was overtaking her again, and Gabriel noticed her flagging energy. I've kept you out too long, he said apologetically. You need rest. I'm fine, Elizabeth protested, though in truth she felt as though she might collapse at any moment. Gabriel shook his head. You've been through hell, Elizabeth. It's okay to need time to recover. His understanding nearly undid her. Since the attack, she had been holding herself together through sheer force of will, afraid that if she allowed herself to truly feel the depth of her trauma, she might shatter completely. I keep seeing them, she admitted in a small voice. Every time I close my eyes, I see my parents dying, our home burning. I hear those men laughing. Gabriel hesitated only a moment before gently placing his hands on her shoulders. Look at me, he said softly. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, You survived. That took incredible courage and strength, and you don't have to carry this burden alone. A sob escaped her, and Gabriel carefully drew her into his arms. Elizabeth knew she should pull away. It was highly improper to embrace a man she barely knew, but his steady heartbeat against her cheek was the first real comfort she'd felt since the nightmare began. I'm scared, she whispered against his shirt. What if they find me? Gabriel's arms tightened protectively around her. I won't let anyone hurt you again, I promise. Elizabeth knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep, but in that moment she chose to believe him. She allowed herself to accept the comfort he offered, drawing strength from his unwavering support. When they returned to the house, Mrs. Reynolds took one look at Elizabeth's exhausted face and insisted she lie down. No arguments, the older woman said firmly. Your body needs time to heal, same as your heart. Elizabeth didn't protest. The emotional weight of the day, combined with her still recovering body, had drained what little energy she had. She slept deeply through the afternoon and evening, waking only briefly when Mrs. Reynolds brought her a tray of supper, which she ate before falling back into dreamless sleep. The next few days established a rhythm. Elizabeth helped Mrs. Reynolds with household tasks during the mornings, then rested in the afternoons. Each evening, Gabriel would join them for supper. His presence a comfort Elizabeth found herself increasingly looking forward to. On her fourth day at the Double R, Sheriff Miller finally arrived to take her statement. Gabriel insisted on being present during the interview, a fact for which Elizabeth was profoundly grateful as she recounted the horrific details of the attack. You're lucky to be alive, Miss Caldwell, the sheriff said when she finished her account. Riley's gang doesn't usually leave witnesses. Can you catch them? Gabriel asked, his voice hard with suppressed anger. Sheriff Miller sighed heavily. We're trying. Problem is, they move fast and know the territory better than most. But this is the first time they've murdered homesteaders outright. Usually they just rob and intimidate. He turned back to Elizabeth. Would you recognize them if you saw them again? Elizabeth nodded. The faces of her parents' killers burned into her memory. Yes, especially their leader. He had a scar from here to here. She traced a line from her left eye to the corner of her mouth. That's Riley, all right, the sheriff confirmed grimly. Jacob Riley, former Confederate soldier turned outlaw, been causing trouble across 3 territories since the war ended. What happens now? Mrs. Reynolds asked from her position by the window. I'll file Miss Caldwell's statement and continue the search, Sheriff Miller said, rising from his chair. In the meantime, she should stay here where it's safe. I'd advise against traveling alone or going into town for a while, just to be cautious. After the sheriff left, Elizabeth retreated to the porch, needing air and solitude to process the emotions his visit had stirred up. Gabriel found her there as the sun was setting, casting the ranch in a golden glow. Are you all right? He asked, leaning against the porch railing beside her. Elizabeth shook her head. I don't know if I'll ever be all right again, she admitted, but I'm alive, which is more than my parents can say. Gabriel was quiet for a moment before speaking. After the war, I didn't think I'd ever feel normal again, the things I saw, the things I did. He trailed off, looking out at the distant mountains. For a long time, I just wandered, taking whatever work I could find, drinking too much, fighting when I shouldn't have. Elizabeth turned to study his profile. What changed, Mrs. Reynolds? Gabriel replied with a small smile. She found me passed out drunk behind her stables one morning. Instead of running me off her property, she offered me a job and a chance to prove I was worth something. His eyes met Elizabeth's. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see past your worst day and believe in who you could be. The sincerity in his gaze made Elizabeth's heart beat faster. Is that what you're doing for me? She asked softly. Believing in who I could be. I believe you're the strongest person I've ever met, Gabriel answered without hesitation. And I believe you'll find your way through this darkness, Elizabeth Caldwell. His faith in her was like a balm to her wounded spirit. Thank you, she whispered, unable to express how much his words meant to her. They stood in companionable silence as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted in shades of purple and deep blue. When the first stars appeared, Gabriel pointed to the brightest one. My mother used to say that's where souls go when they leave this world, he told her. To become stars watching over those they loved, Elizabeth's throat tightened with emotion as she looked up at the emerging constellations. I'd like to believe that, she said, that they're still watching over me somehow. I believe they are, Gabriel replied gently. And I think they'd be proud of how brave you've been. As darkness settled fully around them, Mrs. Reynolds called them in for supper. Elizabeth followed Gabriel inside, feeling lighter than she had since the attack. The grief was still there, it would be for a long time, but for the first time, she could see beyond it to the possibility of healing. The weeks that followed brought gradual change to Elizabeth's shattered world. Spring advanced across the Colorado landscape, painting the ranch in vibrant greens and wildflower blooms. As nature renewed itself, Elizabeth too began to heal, though some wounds would always leave scars. Her nightmares, though still frequent, became less debilitating. During the days, she threw herself into work around the ranch, finding that physical labor helped quiet her troubled mind. Mrs. Reynolds taught her to manage the household accounts, while Gabriel began teaching her to ride again, a skill she needed to relearn after the trauma of her escape. You're a natural, Gabriel encouraged as Elizabeth guided her mount, a gentle mare named Penny, around the corral. Just keep your back straight and your eyes forward. Elizabeth laughed, a sound that had become increasingly common as she completed another circuit. I grew up on a farm, remember? I've been riding since I could walk. Well, you could have fooled me with how tense you were when we started, Gabriel teased, leaning against the fence. Elizabeth sobered slightly. The last time I rode was that night. Sometimes when I close my eyes on horseback, I'm back there running for my life. Gabriel's expression softened with understanding. But you're doing it anyway. That's courage, Elizabeth. She guided Penny to where Gabriel stood and brought the horse to a stop. I couldn't have done it without you, she admitted. Any of this. Gabriel reached up to help her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Yes, you could have, he contradicted gently. You're stronger than you know. Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Elizabeth had become increasingly aware of Gabriel over the past weeks, the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room, how she found herself seeking his company at every opportunity. It was inappropriate, she knew. She was in mourning, dependent on his and Mrs. Reynolds' charity. But her heart seemed unconcerned with propriety. The moment was broken by the arrival of one of the ranch hands, bringing news that required Gabriel's attention. As he rode off to deal with a problem at the far pasture, Elizabeth led Penny back to the stables, lost in thought. That evening at supper, Mrs. Reynolds made an announcement that took Elizabeth by surprise. "I've been thinking," the older woman began, "that we should hold a proper memorial service for your parents, Elizabeth. It's been almost a month now, and it might help you find some closure." Elizabeth set down her fork, overwhelmed by the suggestion. "But we couldn't." She couldn't bring herself to say that there were no bodies to bury. According to Sheriff Miller, nothing remained of her parents or their homestead but ashes. "We don't need remains to honor their memory," Mrs. Reynolds said gently. "Just a marker and some words of remembrance." "The reverend from town would come out if I asked." Gabriel, seated across from Elizabeth, watched her reaction carefully. "It's your decision," he told her, "but I think Mrs. Reynolds might be right. It could help." Elizabeth considered the idea. She had been so focused on survival, on putting one foot in front of the other, that she hadn't properly honored her parents' memory. Perhaps it was time. "Yes," she finally agreed. "I'd like that, thank you." Mrs. Reynolds nodded, pleased. "I'll make the arrangements. We can hold the service on Sunday, on that pretty knoll overlooking the creek." The days leading up to the memorial were difficult for Elizabeth. Memories of her parents flooded back: her father's booming laugh, her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair, the way they had danced together in their small kitchen on winter evenings. She found herself alternating between tears and a strange, peaceful acceptance. On Sunday morning, Elizabeth dressed in her best clothes, a dark blue dress Mrs. Reynolds had altered to fit her, and pinned up her hair with trembling hands. When she emerged from her room, Gabriel was waiting at the foot of the stairs, handsomely dressed in a clean white shirt and dark vest. "You look beautiful," he said softly, offering his arm. Elizabeth blushed at the compliment. "Thank you for everything, Gabriel. I don't know how I'll ever repay you and Mrs. Reynolds for your kindness." Gabriel shook his head. "There's nothing to repay, we're just doing what decent folks should." The service was simple but meaningful. Reverend Phillips spoke eloquently about loss and hope, though he had never met the Caldwells. Mrs. Reynolds had arranged for a small stone marker to be placed on the knoll, engraved with Elizabeth's parents' names and the words "beloved mother and father, forever in our hearts." When it came time for Elizabeth to speak, she found herself surprisingly calm. Standing before the small gathering of ranch hands and neighbors who had come to support her, she shared stories of her parents' love for each other, their courage in building a life on the frontier, and the values they had instilled in her. "They taught me that true strength isn't about never falling," she concluded, her voice clear despite her tears. "It's about rising again afterward. I promise to honor their memory by living as they taught me, with integrity, compassion, and courage." As she placed a bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the marker, Gabriel stepped forward to stand beside her, his solid presence a comfort she had come to rely on. When he took her hand in his, squeezing gently, Elizabeth felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. After the service, everyone gathered at the main house for a meal Mrs. Reynolds had prepared. Elizabeth found herself surrounded by people expressing condolences and sharing their own stories of loss and resilience. The community's support was overwhelming, making her realize she wasn't as alone as she had feared. As the afternoon waned and guests began to depart, Gabriel found Elizabeth sitting alone on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "May I join you?" he asked. Elizabeth nodded, making room for him on the swing. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the gentle creaking of the swing the only sound between them. "How are you feeling?" Gabriel finally asked. Elizabeth considered the question carefully. "Lighter," she decided. "As if I've set down a burden I didn't realize I was carrying." Gabriel nodded in understanding. "Grief needs acknowledgement. It's when we try to ignore it that it grows heavier." You sound like you speak from experience, Elizabeth observed. A shadow crossed Gabriel's face. I've known my share of loss, my father before the war, my brother during it. He paused, then added more quietly, my wife after. Elizabeth turned to him in surprise. You were married? Gabriel nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Briefly, her name was Sarah. We married just before I enlisted, hardly more than children ourselves. She died of fever while I was away fighting. His voice held old pain, long scarred over but never fully healed. I never got to say goodbye. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth whispered, her heart aching for the young man he had been, returning from war only to find his wife gone. Gabriel smiled sadly. It was a long time ago, but I understand what you're going through, Elizabeth, the guilt of surviving when they didn't. The way grief ambushes you when you least expect it. Does it ever go away? She asked. The pain? No, Gabriel answered honestly, but it changes, becomes something you can carry without it crushing you. He turned to look at her directly. And eventually, you find yourself able to feel joy again without thinking you're betraying their memory. Elizabeth's eyes filled with fresh tears at his words. I keep wondering what they would want for me now. My parents, I mean. What do you think they would say if they could speak to you? Gabriel asked gently. Elizabeth wiped away a tear. They would tell me to live, to be happy. She laughed softly through her tears. My mother would probably tell me to stop moping and get on with things. Gabriel smiled. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, Elizabeth agreed, strong too. Like Mrs. Reynolds. They fell silent again, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. When Gabriel's hand found hers on the swing between them, Elizabeth didn't pull away. Instead, she interlaced her fingers with his, drawing comfort from the connection. What happens now? She asked quietly. I can't stay here forever, living on Mrs. Reynolds' charity. Why not? Gabriel challenged. She values your help and you've become important to. He hesitated before finishing, to all of us here. Elizabeth glanced at him, wondering what he had been about to say. I need to build my own life again, Gabriel. Find my own place in the world. Gabriel nodded slowly. I understand that, but maybe your place could be here. His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. You have time to figure it out, Elizabeth. No one's rushing you. As twilight deepened around them, Elizabeth leaned slightly against Gabriel's shoulder, allowing herself to accept the comfort of his presence. For the first time since the attack, she felt truly at peace, as if perhaps her parents were indeed watching over her from that bright star in the sky. The peaceful rhythm of ranch life continued through late spring and into early summer. Elizabeth's nightmares grew less frequent, and she found herself smiling more easily, even laughing occasionally at the ranch hand's good-natured teasing or Mrs. Reynolds' dry observations about life. Her relationship with Gabriel evolved gradually, neither of them acknowledging the growing attraction between them. They rode together in the evenings after his work was done, exploring the vast beauty of the ranch property. During these rides, Gabriel shared stories of his travels after the war, while Elizabeth told him about her childhood on the farm and her dreams before the tragedy. I always wanted to be a teacher, she confessed one evening as they sat atop a ridge overlooking a valley golden with sunset light. I used to practice by teaching the farm animals to do tricks, Gabriel laughed. Did they learn? The dog did. Elizabeth smiled at the memory. The chickens, not so much. You'd make a fine teacher, Gabriel told her seriously. You have patience and kindness, those are the most important qualities. Elizabeth sighed. Perhaps someday, when all this is behind me. Gabriel hesitated before asking, have you given any more thought to what you'll do next? You've been with us almost 2 months now, Mrs. Reynolds has been hinting that she'd like me to stay permanently, Elizabeth replied. She offered to pay me a proper salary as her housekeeper and assistant. And what did you tell her? Elizabeth plucked a wildflower from beside her, twirling it between her fingers. That I needed time to think about it. She glanced at Gabriel. What would you advise? Gabriel's eyes softened as he looked at her. I can't tell you what's right for your future, Elizabeth, but I can tell you that the ranch would be a poorer place without you in it. The simple sincerity of his words warmed her heart. Thank you for that, she said softly. As they rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Elizabeth found herself studying Gabriel's profile. Over the past weeks, He had become essential to her healing, his steady presence a balm to her wounded spirit. She had begun to recognize the flutter in her chest whenever he was near for what it was the beginning of something deeper than friendship or gratitude. The realization should have frightened her. It was too soon after her loss, too complicated given her circumstances. Yet Elizabeth found herself embracing these new feelings, treasuring them as proof that her heart had not died along with her parents that rainy night. The peaceful routine was shattered a week later when Sheriff Miller arrived at the ranch with grave news. Elizabeth was helping Mrs. Reynolds in the kitchen when the sheriff's horse thundered into the yard. From the window, she watched as Gabriel met him, the two men speaking in urgent tones before both glanced toward the house. "That doesn't bode well," Mrs. Reynolds observed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Let's see what's troubling them." They met the men on the porch, where Sheriff Miller removed his hat respectfully. "Mrs. Reynolds, Miss Caldwell," he greeted them, his expression serious. "I'm afraid I have concerning news." Elizabeth's stomach clenched with dread. "What is it?" "Riley's gang was spotted near Bitter Creek, heading this way," the sheriff informed them grimly. "We have reason to believe they know Miss Caldwell survived and is staying here." "How could they possibly know that?" Mrs. Reynolds demanded. Sheriff Miller shook his head. "Small towns have big ears, madam. Word gets around, especially when someone's asking questions." "They've been asking about Elizabeth." Gabriel's voice hardened with anger. "Not directly," the sheriff clarified. "But a stranger matching Riley's description was in town 3 days ago, asking about any survivors from the Caldwell homestead. Said he was a relative come to check on family." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "They're coming for me," she whispered. Gabriel moved to her side immediately, his hand at her elbow steadying her. "We won't let them near you," he promised fiercely. Sheriff Miller nodded in agreement. "I've alerted the neighboring ranches and farms. We're organizing a patrol to intercept them before they can cause any more trouble." "What should we do in the meantime?" Mrs. Reynolds asked practically. "Increase your security," the sheriff advised. "Keep your men armed and alert. I'd suggest Miss Caldwell remain close to the house until we've dealt with this threat." After the sheriff departed, promising to return with more men the following day, Gabriel gathered the ranch hands to organize a watch rotation. Elizabeth found herself confined to the house, her newfound freedom curtailed by the resurgence of danger. That evening, unable to sleep despite the armed guards patrolling the property, Elizabeth slipped downstairs to make herself a cup of tea. She found Gabriel at the kitchen table, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. "You should be resting," he said without looking up. "I can't sleep," Elizabeth admitted, setting the kettle on the stove. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them coming for me again." Gabriel set aside his gun and rose to his feet. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "We have 20 armed men watching this property. Riley would be a fool to try anything. He's already killed 2 people, Elizabeth reminded him. "What's 20 more to a man like that?" Gabriel crossed the kitchen to stand before her, his hands gently grasping her shoulders. "Elizabeth, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "I will die before I let anyone hurt you again. Do you understand that?" The fierce protectiveness in his gaze took her breath away. "I don't want anyone else dying because of me," she whispered. "Especially not you." Something shifted in Gabriel's expression, a tenderness replacing the intensity. "Why especially not me?" he asked softly. Elizabeth's heart hammered in her chest as she realized what she had revealed. "Because you matter to me," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "More than I should allow." Gabriel's hands moved from her shoulders to cup her face. "You matter to me too, Elizabeth, more than I can say." For a suspended moment, they stood frozen, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Gabriel slowly lowered his head, giving her every chance to pull away. Elizabeth didn't move, her eyes fluttering closed as his lips met hers in a gentle kiss. The kettle's whistle broke them apart, Elizabeth stepping back with flushed cheeks as Gabriel turned to remove it from the heat. The moment had passed, but something fundamental had changed between them. "I'm sorry," Gabriel said, though his eyes suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "That was inappropriate." Elizabeth touched her fingers to her lips, still feeling the warmth of his kiss. "No," she contradicted quietly, "it wasn't. After a pause, she added, "But it is complicated." Gabriel nodded in understanding. "We have more pressing concerns right now," he acknowledged. "But when this is over, Elizabeth, we should talk about what's happening between us." "Yes," she agreed. "When this is over." Neither of them could have known how soon that reckoning would come. The attack came at dawn the next day, before the sheriff could return with reinforcements. Elizabeth was woken by the sound of gunfire and shouting. Throwing on a robe over her nightgown, she rushed to the window to see several of the ranch hands exchanging fire with a group of riders who had emerged from the tree line. Her door burst open as Gabriel appeared, fully dressed and armed. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered, crossing to pull her away from the glass. "Mrs. Reynolds is in the cellar. I need you to join her." "What's happening?" Elizabeth asked, though she already knew the answer. "Riley's gang," Gabriel confirmed grimly, "about a dozen of them. They tried to sneak up on us, but our lookouts spotted them." He handed her a small revolver. "Do you know how to use this?" Elizabeth nodded, her father having taught her the basics of shooting years ago. "Yes, but it's just a precaution," Gabriel assured her, guiding her toward the door. "Stay in the cellar with Mrs. Reynolds. Keep this with you. I need to help the men." Elizabeth grabbed his arm as he turned to leave. "Gabriel, be careful, please." He hesitated, then pulled her into a swift, fierce embrace. "I will now go." Elizabeth hurried downstairs to the cellar entrance, finding Mrs. Reynolds already there with a shotgun across her lap. The older woman's expression was calm but determined. "Ah, there you are," she said as Elizabeth descended the stairs. "Sounds like quite the commotion out there." "Aren't you afraid?" Elizabeth asked, taking a seat beside her on an old bench. Mrs. Reynolds snorted. "At my age, I've faced down Comanche raids, drought, blizzards, and the worst kind of two-legged vermin. Takes more than a few outlaws to rattle me." She patted Elizabeth's hand. "Besides, our boys know what they're doing. Gabriel especially." Elizabeth tried to draw comfort from Mrs. Reynolds' confidence, but the sounds of battle raging outside made it difficult. Every shot fired could be claiming the life of someone she had come to care for, or worse, Gabriel himself. The gunfire continued for what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. "What do you think?" Elizabeth began, only to be silenced by Mrs. Reynolds' raised hand. "Listen," the older woman whispered. Footsteps approached the cellar door. Elizabeth raised her revolver, hands trembling slightly as she aimed at the entrance. Mrs. Reynolds likewise leveled her shotgun. The door creaked open. "Mrs. Reynolds, Elizabeth, it's me." Gabriel's voice was the sweetest sound Elizabeth had ever heard. She lowered her weapon as he descended the stairs, his face smudged with dirt and gunpowder but otherwise unharmed. Without thinking, Elizabeth threw herself into his arms, relief making her knees weak. "You're all right," she breathed, her hands moving over his chest and shoulders as if to confirm his wholeness. Gabriel held her tightly for a moment before pulling back to address them both. "It's over. We drove them off." "Any casualties?" Mrs. Reynolds asked sharply. "2 of our men wounded, but nothing life-threatening," Gabriel reported. "And we got one of them. The rest fled when they realized they were outmatched." "Which one did you get?" Elizabeth asked, dreading the answer. "Not Riley," Gabriel admitted. "One of his lieutenants. Sheriff Miller just arrived with his posse. They're going after the rest." Mrs. Reynolds rose stiffly from the bench. "Well, I'd better see to those wounded boys. No doubt they could use some tending." As the older woman ascended the stairs, Gabriel turned back to Elizabeth, his expression grave. "Riley got away, but he won't stop coming for you," he said bluntly. "Not until he's certain you can't testify against him." Elizabeth sank back onto the bench, the relief of their immediate safety giving way to the grim reality of her situation. "So I'll never be safe," she concluded. "Not as long as he's free." Gabriel knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "There's another option," he said quietly. "You could leave, go east where he can't find you, start fresh under a new name, run away." Elizabeth shook her head. "No. I won't spend my life looking over my shoulder, afraid of shadows, and I won't let him take anything more from me." Her voice strengthened with resolve. "This is my home now, Gabriel. I'm staying and fighting." A slow smile spread across Gabriel's face, pride shining in his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that," he admitted. Because I have a plan, but it only works if you're willing to take a risk. What kind of risk? Elizabeth asked. The kind that might end this once and for all, Gabriel replied, but it means using you as bait to draw Riley out. Elizabeth felt a chill at his words, but she didn't hesitate. Tell me what I need to do. Gabriel outlined his plan, a daring scheme that would use Riley's determination to silence Elizabeth against him. With the sheriff's cooperation, they would spread word that Elizabeth was planning to travel to Denver to testify before a territorial judge. The journey would provide the perfect opportunity for Riley to attempt another attack, but this time, they would be prepared. It's dangerous, Gabriel acknowledged when he finished explaining, if anything goes wrong. It won't, Elizabeth said with more confidence than she felt. And even if it does, this is my choice, Gabriel. I'm tired of being a victim. Gabriel's expression was a mixture of admiration and concern. You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Elizabeth Caldwell, she smiled faintly. Not brave, just stubborn. There's no difference as far as I can tell, Gabriel replied, returning her smile. When they emerged from the cellar, they found the ranch in a state of controlled chaos. The wounded were being tended in the bunkhouse, while the sheriff and his men prepared to pursue Riley's gang. Gabriel immediately sought out Sheriff Miller to share his plan. The sheriff was skeptical at first. It's risky, he pointed out. Miss Caldwell would be putting herself in considerable danger. I'm already in danger, Elizabeth countered. At least this way we choose the battlefield. After further discussion and refinement of the details, Sheriff Miller reluctantly agreed. We'll spread the word that you'll be traveling to Denver next week, he told Elizabeth. Make it seem like you're finally ready to give formal testimony that could hang Riley. And I'll accompany her as protection, Gabriel added, along with a few trusted men. Meanwhile, I'll have deputies positioned along the route, the sheriff continued. Riley won't be able to resist such an opportunity, especially if we make it look like your escort is minimal. The plan set, they spent the next several days in preparation. Word was deliberately leaked in town about Elizabeth's upcoming journey. Gabriel selected 3 of his most trusted fellow ranch hands to accompany them, all experienced fighters who had served in the war. The night before their departure, Elizabeth found herself unable to sleep once again. She stood at her bedroom window, gazing out at the star-filled sky, wondering if tomorrow would bring an end to the nightmare that had begun on that rainy night months ago. A soft knock at her door drew her attention. Come in, she called quietly. Gabriel entered, looking as restless as she felt. I saw your light, he explained. Thought you might be having trouble sleeping too, Elizabeth nodded. I keep thinking about tomorrow, about what might happen. Gabriel crossed to stand beside her at the window. It's not too late to change your mind, he offered. No one would think less of you. I would think less of me, Elizabeth replied simply. I need to do this, Gabriel, for my parents, for myself. Gabriel's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. I know, he said softly. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you. Elizabeth turned to face him, her heart pounding at the raw emotion in his voice. Why, Mr. Hayes, she teased gently, trying to lighten the moment. One might almost think you care for me. I more than care for you, Elizabeth, Gabriel said seriously. I love you. The simple declaration stole her breath. Gabriel, you don't need to say anything, he hurried to assure her. I know it's too soon, that you're still healing, but I wanted you to know before tomorrow, just in case. Elizabeth reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. It's not too soon, she whispered, and I don't need more time to know what's in my heart. She drew a deep breath before continuing. I love you too, Gabriel. I think I have since that night in the rain when you gave me your coat and promised to keep me safe. Gabriel's arms slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. I intend to keep that promise, he murmured. Tomorrow and every day after. When he kissed her this time, there was no interruption, no hesitation. Elizabeth melted into his embrace, allowing herself to feel the full measure of her love for this man who had become her protector, her friend, and now something far more precious. Eventually, Gabriel reluctantly pulled away. I should go, he said, though his arms remained around her. We need to be rested for tomorrow. Elizabeth nodded, though letting him leave was the last thing she wanted. Tomorrow, she agreed, After it's over, we'll have time to talk about everything. Gabriel pressed one more gentle kiss to her forehead before stepping back. Get some sleep, Elizabeth. I'll see you at dawn. After he left, Elizabeth returned to her bed, but sleep remained elusive. Her mind was filled with thoughts of Gabriel and the future they might have together once Riley was no longer a threat. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond survival, a life filled with love and purpose. With that comforting vision, she finally drifted into peaceful slumber. Dawn broke clear and bright, a beautiful day for a journey or a trap. Elizabeth dressed carefully in a practical riding outfit Mrs. Reynolds had procured for her, her hair braided and pinned securely under a wide-brimmed hat. The small revolver Gabriel had given her was tucked into a concealed pocket of her skirt within easy reach. When she descended to the kitchen, she found Gabriel and his chosen men already there, reviewing their plans one final time over coffee and biscuits. Mrs. Reynolds was packing food for their journey, her movements brisk and efficient despite the worry evident in her eyes. "There you are," the older woman said when she spotted Elizabeth. "Come eat something before you go." Elizabeth accepted a plate, though her stomach was too knotted with tension to feel hungry. She managed a few bites to please Mrs. Reynolds, who was watching her like a hawk. "Now, you listen to me," Mrs. Reynolds said, pulling Elizabeth aside before they departed. "You do exactly as Gabriel tells you out there. No heroics, you understand?" "Yes, madam," Elizabeth promised. Mrs. Reynolds squeezed her hands tightly. "And you come back to us, child. This house needs you in it." Elizabeth blinked back unexpected tears at the older woman's words. In the months since her parents' deaths, Mrs. Reynolds had become a surrogate mother, offering wisdom, comfort, and occasionally stern guidance when needed. "I will," Elizabeth assured her. "We all will." Their departure from the ranch was deliberately conspicuous. They rode out in broad daylight, taking the main road toward town before turning onto the Denver Trail. Sheriff Miller and his deputies had already left hours earlier, positioning themselves at strategic points along the route where Riley might choose to attack. The first few hours of their journey passed uneventfully. They maintained a steady pace, Gabriel riding beside Elizabeth while the other three men formed a protective formation around them. They spoke little, every sense alert for danger. By midday, they had reached a narrow pass between two rocky ridges, the location they had identified as the most likely spot for an ambush. It offered clear advantages to attackers: high ground on both sides, limited visibility, and few escape routes. "This is it," Gabriel said quietly as they approached the pass. "Stay close to me." Elizabeth nodded, her hand moving to rest on the revolver in her pocket. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it, but she kept her expression calm. They entered the pass at a walk, the horses' hooves crunching on loose gravel. The silence was eerie. No birds sang, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. Nature itself seemed to be holding its breath. They were halfway through the pass when the first shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dust just ahead of Gabriel's horse. Instantly, the men moved into defensive positions, Gabriel pulling Elizabeth's horse close to his. "There." One of the ranch hands shouted, pointing to movement on the ridge to their right. More shots followed, a barrage of gunfire raining down from both sides of the pass. Gabriel pulled Elizabeth from her saddle, practically throwing her behind a large boulder for cover before taking position beside her, his rifle already firing at the attackers. "Stay down," he ordered, though Elizabeth had no intention of doing otherwise. The other ranch hands had also found cover, returning fire with precision. From the shouts and curses from above, their shots were finding their marks. "Where's the sheriff?" Elizabeth gasped between bursts of gunfire. "He'll be here," Gabriel assured her, pausing to reload. "This is exactly what we planned for." As if summoned by his words, new gunfire erupted, but this time it came from behind the attackers' positions. Sheriff Miller and his deputies had sprung the trap, catching Riley's gang in their own ambush. Caught between two forces, several of the outlaws began to retreat, only to find more lawmen blocking their escape routes. The carefully laid plan was working perfectly until Elizabeth spotted a lone figure scrambling down the ridge directly toward their position. "Gabriel," she warned, pointing. Gabriel swung his rifle toward the approaching threat, but had to duck as another bullet whizzed past his head. In that moment of distraction, the figure reached the bottom of the ridge and darted behind a nearby outcropping, now only yards from their position. Elizabeth recognized him instantly from the scar that twisted his features into a permanent sneer. Jacob Riley had decided to take matters into his own hands. Well, Riley's voice carried clearly despite the continuing gunfire. "If it isn't the little girl who got away." Gabriel positioned himself protectively in front of Elizabeth. "It's over, Riley," he called out. "Your men are surrounded. Surrender now and you might avoid the noose." Riley's laugh was chilling. "I ain't planning on surrendering, boy. But I am planning on finishing what I started with that family of settlers." There was a pause before he added, "Although, I gotta say, the girl's prettier than I remembered. Might have kept her alive a bit longer if I'd noticed that first time around." Elizabeth felt rage bubble up inside her at his casual cruelty. The man who had murdered her parents, destroyed her home, and haunted her nightmares was just a few yards away, taunting them. "You're not touching her," Gabriel growled, his voice hard with barely controlled fury. "We'll see about that," Riley replied. "Here's what's going to happen. The girl's going to come out nice and easy, or I start picking off your friends one by one, starting with that old fellow over by the fallen tree." Elizabeth peered around the boulder to see one of their ranch hands, an older man named Frank, exposed in his position. From where Riley was hiding, he had a clear shot. "Don't listen to him," Gabriel told her urgently. "The sheriff will be here any minute." But Elizabeth could see that Riley had the advantage. While the rest of his gang was occupied with the sheriff and deputies, Riley had managed to isolate himself in a position that threatened their immediate group. "I can't let him kill anyone else because of me," Elizabeth whispered. Before Gabriel could stop her, she called out, "If I come out, you'll let the others live." "Elizabeth, no," Gabriel hissed, grabbing her arm. "You have my word," Riley responded, though his word was clearly worthless. Elizabeth turned to Gabriel, her mind racing. "I have a plan," she whispered. "But I need you to trust me." Gabriel's expression was agonized. "I can't let you sacrifice yourself." "I'm not planning to," Elizabeth assured him. She quickly outlined her idea, a desperate gambit, but one that might work if Riley's arrogance was as great as it seemed. After a moment of internal struggle, Gabriel nodded reluctantly. "Be careful," he pleaded, pressing a swift kiss to her lips. Elizabeth took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "I'm coming out, Riley," she called. "Don't shoot, smart girl," Riley responded, "nice and slow now." Elizabeth stood, keeping her hands visible as she stepped out from behind the boulder. She could see Riley now, half hidden behind the rocky outcropping, his gun trained on her. "That's it," he encouraged. "Keep coming." Elizabeth moved forward cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to continue, counting on Riley's confidence to blind him to the threat she posed. "You know," Riley said conversationally as she approached, "you've caused me a lot of trouble, girl. Had to change all my plans because of you." "Sorry to inconvenience you," Elizabeth replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "It must be difficult having a witness to your murders." Riley's eyes narrowed at her defiance. "You got spirit, I'll give you that. Might be fun breaking it before I kill you." Elizabeth was close enough now to see the malice in his eyes, the same cruel enjoyment she had witnessed the night he killed her parents. Her hand inched toward her concealed pocket. "Any last words before we get started?" Riley asked, clearly savoring the moment. Elizabeth met his gaze unflinchingly. "Just one," she said. "Goodbye." In one fluid motion, she drew the revolver from her pocket and fired. The bullet caught Riley in the shoulder, spinning him backward with a howl of pain and surprise. Before he could recover, Gabriel emerged from behind the boulder, his rifle aimed squarely at Riley's chest. "Drop the gun," Gabriel ordered. Now, Riley, clutching his bleeding shoulder, glared at them both with pure hatred. For a moment, Elizabeth thought he might try to shoot anyway, but then Sheriff Miller's voice rang out from above. "It's over, Riley. Your men are either dead or in custody. Throw down your weapon." Surrounded and wounded, Riley finally recognized his defeat. With a curse, he dropped his gun. As Gabriel moved to secure Riley, Sheriff Miller and several deputies arrived to take the outlaw into custody. The gunfire had stopped throughout the pass. The brief but intense battle concluded with the law victorious. "You did it," Sheriff Miller told Elizabeth as his men led Riley away. "Your testimony will ensure he hangs for what he did to your family, along with his other crimes." Elizabeth nodded, feeling strangely hollow as she watched the man who had dominated her nightmares for months being led away in chains. She had expected to feel triumph or at least relief, but instead she felt only a quiet certainty that a chapter of her life had finally closed. Gabriel appeared at her side, his arms slipping around her waist. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Elizabeth leaned into his strength. "I will be," she answered honestly. "It's finally over." "Yes," Gabriel agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And now something new can begin." The journey back to the Double R Ranch was subdued but peaceful. One of their men had taken a bullet in the leg during the firefight, but the wound was not serious. Compared to what might have happened, they had emerged remarkably unscathed. Mrs. Reynolds was waiting anxiously on the porch when they rode into the yard. The relief on her face when she saw them all return safely was palpable. She hugged Elizabeth fiercely, then surprised Gabriel with an equally enthusiastic embrace. "Thank the Lord," she said fervently. "When I heard the shooting all the way from here, I feared the worst." "It worked exactly as planned," Gabriel told her, though the look he exchanged with Elizabeth acknowledged just how close they had come to disaster. That evening, after the excitement had settled and the wounded had been tended to, Elizabeth found herself once again on the porch swing, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. The events of the day felt almost dreamlike now. The gunfight, her confrontation with Riley, the end of her long nightmare. Gabriel joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her one. "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, warming her hands around the cup. "For everything." Gabriel settled beside her on the swing, their shoulders touching comfortably. "I should be thanking you," he said. "What you did today was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "I learned from the best." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the gentle creaking of the swing and the distant sounds of the ranch creating a peaceful backdrop. "I've been thinking," Gabriel finally said. "About what happens next." Elizabeth turned to look at him. "And what have you decided?" Gabriel set aside his coffee cup and took her hand in his. "That depends entirely on you, Elizabeth Caldwell." "On me?" she asked, her pulse quickening at the seriousness in his tone. "Yes," Gabriel confirmed, "because what I want is to spend the rest of my life with you. To build something together, right here if that's what you want, or somewhere else if it isn't." He smiled softly. "I meant what I said last night. I love you." Elizabeth's heart swelled with emotion. "I love you too," she whispered, "and there's nowhere else I'd rather be than here with you." Gabriel's expression brightened with hope. "Does that mean?" "Yes," Elizabeth nodded, tears of joy pricking her eyes. "If you're asking what I think you're asking, then yes, Gabriel Hayes, I want to build a life with you." Gabriel's smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted, "but I promise to get you one as soon as possible." Elizabeth laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her. "I don't need a ring," she assured him, "just you." Their kiss was a promise of love, of healing, of a future neither had dared to imagine months before when fate had brought them together on a stormy night. The wedding took place 2 months later, a joyous celebration that brought together the entire ranch community. Mrs. Reynolds insisted on hosting the event, treating Elizabeth like the daughter she had never had. The ceremony was held on the same knoll where Elizabeth's parents' memorial marker stood, a way of including them in her happiness. Elizabeth wore a simple white dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers. Gabriel, handsome in a new suit, watched her approach with wonder in his eyes, as if he couldn't believe his good fortune. Sheriff Miller attended, bringing news that Jacob Riley had been tried and sentenced to hang for his crimes. The knowledge brought Elizabeth not joy but a sense of closure, allowing her to fully embrace her future without the shadow of the past hanging over her. As they exchanged vows beneath the Colorado sky, Elizabeth thought of that rainy night that had changed everything, the terror and loss, yes, but also the unexpected gift it had ultimately brought her. If she hadn't fled into that storm, if Gabriel hadn't found her huddled beneath those trees, if he hadn't covered her with his coat and promised to keep her safe. Life was strange that way, she reflected. Sometimes the darkest moments led to the brightest futures. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend declared, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. "You may kiss your bride." Gabriel's kiss was tender and full of promise as the onlookers erupted in cheers and applause. As they turned to face their friends, Elizabeth caught sight of Mrs. Reynolds dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, not bothering to hide her tears of joy. "Are you happy?" Gabriel whispered as they made their way back down the knoll. Elizabeth looked up at her husband, her heart so full it felt it might burst. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than the entire ranch could possibly consume. Elizabeth danced with Gabriel beneath lantern light, her laughter joining the music that filled the warm summer air. Later, as the party wound down, they slipped away to the small cabin Gabriel had spent weeks preparing for them, a cozy home on the edge of the ranch property, close enough to be part of the community but private enough to be their own sanctuary. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," Gabriel said softly as he carried her across the threshold. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around his neck, overcome with love for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. "I like the sound of that," she murmured before kissing him. 5 years later, Elizabeth stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Gabriel taught their 3-year-old son to ride his first pony. Little James Thomas Hayes, named for both their fathers, clung to the saddle with determination, his face a miniature version of Gabriel's with Elizabeth's blue eyes. "Not too fast," she called, instinctively protective even though Gabriel would never let their son come to harm. Gabriel grinned up at her. He's a natural, just like his mother. Their daughter, Sarah Rose, barely a year old, squirmed in Elizabeth's arms, eager to join the excitement. "You'll have your turn soon enough, little one," Elizabeth promised, kissing the top of her downy head, Mrs. Reynolds, who had become grandma to their children despite no blood relation, emerged from the house carrying a tray of lemonade. Now well into her 70s, she had officially retired from running the ranch, though she still kept a sharp eye on operations. Gabriel had been promoted to foreman 3 years earlier and was being groomed to take over management entirely. "That boy's going to be a champion rider," Mrs. Reynolds observed proudly as James squealed with delight when the pony trotted in a small circle. "Just what we need, another cowboy in the family," Elizabeth teased, though her heart swelled with pride. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over their little homestead, Elizabeth reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the terror of that rainy night to the joy of the present day, it was a path she could never have imagined for herself. The nightmares had faded years ago, replaced by dreams of the future she and Gabriel were building together. Their children would grow up knowing the story of how their parents met, a tale of loss and courage, of a rain-soaked escape, and a coat offered in kindness, of love blooming from tragedy. Gabriel brought James back to the porch, the tired but happy boy immediately running to show his mother what he had learned. As Elizabeth knelt to embrace her son, Gabriel caught her eye over the child's head, his gaze filled with the same love that had sustained them through everything. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Elizabeth and Gabriel sat on their porch swing, a ritual they had maintained since their courtship days. The stars shone brilliantly overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting all those years ago. "Any regrets?" Gabriel asked, his arm around her shoulders as they gently swayed. Elizabeth considered the question, thinking of all they had built together, their home, their family, their life of purpose and love. "Not a single one," she answered truthfully. Gabriel smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Me neither." As they sat together beneath the vast Colorado sky, Elizabeth thought once more of that desperate night when she had fled into the rain with torn clothes and a broken heart. She could never have imagined then that a stranger's coat would lead to such happiness, that the worst night of her life would ultimately guide her to the best days she had ever known. Life's greatest blessings, she had learned, often came disguised as its greatest challenges. And love, true love, could grow even from the ashes of despair, blooming like wildflowers after a cleansing rain.